Receive our prayers at this present time for our conference honoring the memory of your servant Stanley Jaki. Direct our lives according to your commandment. Sanctify our souls, nourish our minds, purify our bodies. Cleanse our thoughts and deliver us from all sorrow, evil, and distress. Surround us with your holy angels, that guarded and guided by them, we may arrive at the unity of faith and the understanding of your ineffable glory, for you are blessed to the ages of ages. Amen.
Amen. Thank you very much, Father Hafner, for this beautiful prayer. So I'm so happy we have guests in this event actually coming from Europe, coming from Latin America. So it's a wonderful celebration, celebrating the legacy of Father Jaki. Celebrating his legacy, actually, it has become a yearly tradition at Seton Hall University since 2013, 1 year after the foundation of the Department of Catholic Studies. We have been harvesting our treasures, just to use, the motto of our new strategic plan, and celebrating the legacy of Father Jaki is really harvesting our treasures. I remember actually my dear colleague from the physics department, Dr. Jose Lopez, and he is a faculty member actually in the home department of Father Jaki. We met in Rome with Father Hafner, Dr. Lopez and myself, and we were planning all these events. We were commemorating Father Jaki. We had a beautiful dinner actually, celebrating Father Jaki, and then one thing brought another. We planned and we talked and planned, we acted, but as soon as we returned to New Jersey, Jose and we said we have to do something, and we did it. Okay, we did it. We started with an event, the first event on Father Jaki, and then Father Hafner was so gracious to come up with a course on the popes and science that he still teaches for Catholic studies. One of the a very popular course, in our among our offerings. And then this kind of spread more and more, from the physics department, which was the home department of Father Jaki, to other departments, to biology, to mathematics, and so on and so forth. So I'm also very grateful to Dr. Stacy Trasankos, because she was one of the first Jaki scholars to come on board with these initiatives. And of course, Dr. Trasankos came up with a course for Catholic studies, Catholic theology of science, which is really based on the teachings and also, the vision of Father Jaki. So many thanks, colleagues, and I'll mention all the colleagues here who have contributed so much in this project, Father Jaki project, if you will, both in academic, meaning including his vision, his mission in academic courses, but also celebrating his legacy. And I'll mention them. So I said Father Joseph Larrissey is also a key person in all these events. We could have never done it without Father Larrissey. Dr. Mehmet Sahiner has always been a close friend of Catholic studies. And of course, he is the chair of the Department of Physics at Seton Hall University, but always on board with this activities. Of course, Dr. Jose Lopez, Dr. Anthony Troja, Dr. Weining Wang, Dr. Tina Chu from biology, Dr. Malloy that now is in heaven, Dr. Thomas Marlowe. I have to thank Dr. Marlowe, because he has been with Catholic Studies, a close friend of Catholic Studies. And I remember when we put all the courses together, especially courses of the science, Dr. Marlowe was a key person in advising me on that. I would also want to thank Father Jerry Bonopane, Dr. John Saccoman, all these colleagues who are following in the footsteps of Father Jaki, applying interdisciplinary methodologies in their teaching, and of course, you know, for all of us here at Seton Hall, interdisciplinarity is also a key element, a key factor in the new strategic plan. So now we connected all this legacy, let's say, and celebration that we have done for about Father Jaki since 2013 with the Chesterton Institute. Many of us actually have asked me why is this? And of course, you know, Father Jaki being, you know, of course, a theologian, a physicist, because he was also scientist by training, a theologian, a philosopher. He also was very interested in Chesterton. And Father Jaki actually wrote a book on Chesterton, A Seer of Science. And this book actually in 2021, yes, it's 35-year-old book. And it's based on some lectures that Father Jaki gave to the University of Notre Dame, where he argues about Chesterton as an interpreter of science. So again, thank you for coming, and that is my introduction. Now I will give the floor to my dear colleague from the physics department. He is the chair of the physics department, Mehmet Sahiner, to say a few words about his distinguished colleague.
Thank you, Ines. Thank you for all coming in such a beautiful day and from all over the places. And thank you, Gloria, Ines, and for organizing this. And thanks to our panelists. I will just start with Dr. Jaki's a short bio. He's a great man. Of course, it's very difficult to talk his bio in a short terms, but his main contributions to physics and his in theoretical physics and also experimental physics, which I learned much later on, and finish with a personal story with Jaki, Father Jaki. So Father Jaki, as you all know, distinguished university professor at Seton Hall University, priest, Catholic priest, a physicist, and born in Hungary, Győr, Hungary in 1924. So after graduating from preparatory school and junior college, he entered the Benedictine order in 1942 and began studies philosophy, theology, and mathematics. And after that, he went in 1947 to Rome, where he continued his theological study in Pontifical Institute of San Anselmo, Rome, and gained his doctorate degree in 1950. Then he came to the United States. All right, he went to Pennsylvania actually, and he taught systematic theology at the School of Theology of St. Vincent College in Latrobe, Pennsylvania. And at the same time, he earned his bachelor's degree in physics in 1954 from the same institute. And because of health reasons, he gave a little pause to his teaching, and then did his graduate studies in Fordham University and started his PhD program and received his PhD in 1957 from Fordham University. His thesis advisor was Professor Victor Hess. He was a Nobel laureate in 1936 for discovery of the cosmic radiation. So he was in the right place to do his magnificent physics studies. And then after the Fordham, between 58 and 60, he did research in the Stanford University and University of California, Berkeley. And 60 to 62, he was a visiting fellow in the program for history and philosophy and of science at Princeton University. And finally, 1965, he joined Seton Hall. And from 1965 to until his death in 2009, he was a faculty member in our department, physics department at Seton Hall University. He was promoted to rank of the distinguished university professor in 1975. And in 1966 and 67, he was associated with the Institute of the Advanced Study at Princeton. And then he was a visiting professor in the Princeton Theological Seminary and also a fellow in the Center of Theological Inquiry in Princeton from 84 to 87, 89 to 90. He was a noted writer, leading writer, more than 40 books on interdisciplinary studies of area science and theology. He was also the recipient of the Templeton Prize for Progress in Religion and for Furthering Understanding the Science of and Religion in 1987. And also in theoretical physics, he was one of the first person who recognized the significance of the Kurt-Gödel's theorem of incompleteness. So the theorem says that basically any non-trivial theory starting with very solid axioms cannot be complete or at the same time consistent. Okay, so but the physicist on the other hand is trying to find the theory of everything. So basically, it's an essential violation of this thing, and that was a highly argument from the physicist and mathematical point for years. So he was one of the first persons who noted that there is something closely related with the theory of everything in physics and the Gödel theorem. He wrote a lot of philosophical books of science and religion, theology, but he also did an experimental nuclear physics during his thesis. And that was from Dr. Troa's paper. There was, as Ines mentioned, the 2015 Jaki conference honoring him. And Dr. Troa made a contribution about his early research in physics, Jaki's early research from Fordham, and he found his papers. And this is his work with Victor Hess, the Nobel laureate. And it is basically the title of the paper is a study of distribution of radon and thoron and their decay products above and below the ground. Jaki and Hess, Journal of Geophysical Research, 1958. So basically, I mean, radon and thoron was as you know, radioactive gases, and it's still a big problem in New Jersey and many of the states. And so what they are trying to do how is the distribution of these radioactive gases under the ground and just above the ground? And their major finding is it is not the thoron, but radon, because thoron having a short lifetime just decays very fast. And what is left on the ground, about 1 meter above the ground, is mostly 65% radon. That's a major significant finding. And believe me, now the environmental science engineers, everybody is still referring to those that paper, 1958 paper on that one. Everything's okay. So that was and when I bought my house in New Jersey, there was a big radon pipe from the ground from the basement to the thing, and it is basically because of the distribution of the radon just above the ground, and then basically decaying very fast. So if you raise this radon gas to the roof, it is a big remedy. Okay, and so in 2011, when Dr. Lopez joined the physics department, and we lost Father Jaki in 2009, we decided that maybe we should do a kind of a distinguished lecture series with honoring Father Jaki. And our first speaker was Freeman Dyson, Professor Freeman Dyson from Institute of Advanced Study in Princeton. And he gave an excellent lecture. And he was also, as you know, a Templeton Prize winner, recipient. We lost him in February 2020. And so then we started with as Ines mentioned, the program with the Catholic Studies joint events, and we organized a joint Jaki conference in 2015, and some of you were also involved in that work. Finally, I'm just going to leave the word to the panelists, but I have a personal story with Father Jaki. Of course, when I joined the Seton Hall, he was not regularly coming to the department, but he came several times, and I met in one of the cases. And at that time, we were not in McNulty Hall, our current department in the science building, but because of the renovation of the McNulty Hall, all the departments, including the physics, were moved to Mooney Hall, which was a formerly priest residences. And my office was a formerly priest residence, and I had a shower and a little bathroom in the office. Father Jaki came and just saw me when I was working in my office and said, hey, we talked for a little chat, and he said to me, oh, you have a bathroom right now, huh? You have a bathroom and shower. If only you had a small kitchen, then it will be a 24-hour dream office for a physicist. You never had to leave. So he was a really hard worker, and he was dedicated hard work in this profession indeed. And I'm honored to be a part of this department with his name. And thanks for again to Ines to organizing this for those. And I'll thank to all our panelists. I'm just gonna give the word to Dr. Lopez now to introduce our distinguished panelists. Thank you for joining.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us today for this special workshop that has been organized excellently, as you'll see, by the various departments here at the university. We are going to initially start with our speakers giving presentations, brief presentations, approximately 20 minutes each. We'll reserve some time at the end for discussion. And if the panelists, of course, would like to answer some questions, I'll be monitoring the chats of what different people say. So we have 4 panelists. I'll introduce them, and then I will just ask them to present their thoughts. So our first panelist is Father Paul Hafner, and Father Hafner is studied physics as an undergraduate, and he initially studied at had it here somewhere. Oh, he initially studied at Corpus Christi College at Oxford University. He then went on to seminary studies at the Venerable English College, and then on to the Pontifical Gregorian University, where he received his doctorate in in the connections with faith to modern science. Father Hafner was ordained a priest in the Diocese of Portsmouth in the United Kingdom in 1981. And for over the last 20 years, I would say, Father Hafner has been living in Rome and working in Rome. He has served as a professor of theology at the Duquesne University Italian campus, and he has been a visiting professor at a Pontifical Gregorian University. And as Dr. Murzako was saying, he has also been an adjunct faculty in our Department of Catholic Studies, teaching a wonderful course on popes and science. And he has written over 30 books and 150 articles on philosophical and theological themes. And he is probably the foremost authority on Father Jaki in the world. He is the founder and the president of the Stanley Jaki Foundation, which includes, we actually have 2/3 of the officers of the Stanley Jaki Foundation on the panel today. I'll introduce Father Larrissey a little bit later. Along with Father Larrissey, who is the treasurer, we also have the secretary, Dr. Antonio Colombo, who has also done a tremendous work in the legacy of Father Jaki. Father Hafner will now present his talk, which is entitled Chesterton's Realism and the Work of Stanley L. Jaki. Father Hafner?
Thank you very much, Jose. I hope you can all hear me. Around a century ago, G.K. Chesterton had noted that the 19th century left everything in chaos, at least philosophically, and he stressed that Thomist realism was required to restore the cosmos to us. Our brief discussion is going to outline how Chesterton, while not furnishing a systematic notion of realism, offers us an inspiring discursive approach, which is rather similar to Jaki's own, perhaps more systematic guide to a realist approach to the universe. Starting on a personal note, I remember that as a teenage boy, I read G.K. Chesterton's The Man Who Was Thursday, alongside other favorite detective novels like Sherlock Holmes, Miss Marple from Agatha Christie, Hercule Poirot. And Chesterton's The Man Who Was Thursday didn't seem to me very realistic. It was very abstract, and for a boy of about 16, certainly at that time, who was already studying physics, it was a curious experience. The novel set, as you know, in the Edwardian era. You've got 2 poets in the garden of an artist's colony, located in a fictional new garden city named Saffron Park. It could be Milton Keynes in the UK. Mr. Lucian Gregory, the red-haired poet, holding court and he's, if you like, the anarchist. And he's faced with another poet, Mr. Gabriel Syme, who politely doubts the anarchist's commitment. Gregory argues that poetry is by nature anarchical and breaks the rules. Syme counters that poetry is law and gives us an example, the wonderful poetry of the London Underground, the Tube, as it's called there, where you have a map and know exactly which station is coming next on any journey. It's a very logical, I know for myself, because I was born in London, very logical thing, the London Tube. And basically, Gregory, the anarchist poet, waits for the party to end and then faces Syme outside the ground of his house. And at that point, Gregory reveals that he really is an anarchist and makes Syme swear not to tell anyone, at which point Syme reveals that he's really a policeman, but that, on the other hand, Gregory must tell no one. So each solemnly swear not to tell each other's secret. And so there you already see Chesterton's taste for symmetry and paradox, but doesn't yet define a systematic realism. And Gregory then takes Syme along to a pub and meets a type of secret society, which is basically an anarchist chapter. And each of these has a different name of the week. And interestingly, they need to elect somebody for the day of the week known as Thursday. And because I think of Syme's cleverness, Syme the policeman is in fact elected Thursday. So again, this is Chesterton's psychological fantasy in a way. And if you try applying simplistic realist criteria, you seem to get nowhere. What develops is that the man who was Thursday is really an effective spine-chilling nightmare, because the 6 other men, apart from Gregory, had sworn to destroy the world through their anarchical principles. So there is something very prophetic there as well. And as time goes on, it goes abroad, outside of the UK, and eventually it turns out the novel does recount a nightmare, Syme's nightmare, and he slept while he was walking in the country. And he then resumes his walk along this country lane in a little epiphany of the kind of values, images, and ideas which Chesterton himself cherishes: the countryside, tradition, good fellowship. And at that time, it should be added, Chesterton was still an Anglican when he wrote this. And it shows, therefore, the realism transcends, if you like, ecclesiastical boundaries, and therefore has some ecumenical values, this realism. And in the end, a distant voice in the novel says, "Can ye drink of the cup that I drink of?" So the basis of the realism, which in this novel Chesterton is proposing, is a Christological basis. We should remember that, we'll come back to it. In many ways, this novel is a response to the great wave of anarchist, socialist, positive, and nihilist thinking that swept through Europe in the 1890s and 1900s. As I said elsewhere, in fact, the 3 perhaps counter-ideologies which existed at that time were sort of Marxist views in politics, Darwinist ideologies of science, and also Freudian analysis later on in the concept of the human being. So these trends are materialists, denying the existence of a soul or God, insisting purely on a material world, a chaotic struggle without any transcendent value. So Chesterton's response is providing a non-systematic but most valid and homely defense, you could say, of a world, of a cosmos rooted in reality. And that reality is in turn finally and firmly anchored in a Christological perspective. A few years after reading Chesterton's The Man Who Was Thursday, as Jose very kindly noted, I went up, we say in England, we went up to Oxford to read physics. And during, I think, my second year, the Easter vacation, Peter Hodgson, who was now departed, but he was a great Jaki scholar, and he introduced me to Stanley Jaki's work entitled The Relevance of Physics. Now, I must confess, just like with The Man Who Was Thursday, I found during that Easter vac, as we call it in Oxford, facing the relevance of physics was not an easy task, because Jaki doesn't define a systematic realism, but he's in the same Thomistic realistic vein as Chesterton. And perhaps we could say Father Jaki most original achievement was the defense of the reality of the cosmos formulated in contemporary scientific, philosophical, and ultimately theological terms. The question's a vital one, given that while the universe remains the ground that alone can assure consistency to a scientific as well as a philosophical discourse, it has failed to be given its due, not only in philosophy and theology, but also in science. Now, to remedy this perceived neglect, Jaki has returned to this theme again and again in his writings. And this defense of the reality of being, but above all the reality of the cosmos, is a golden thread running through, weaving in and out his many writings. He runs through in his various books, I don't need to do that here, the whole gamut of philosophy and philosophy of science, from the ancient Greeks to Aristotle and Plato, through the Middle Ages, Aquinas, who inherited some of the Aristotelian corpus, and St. Thomas Aquinas stated, in effect, the perfection of the totality, universitas in Latin, of creatures, consists in its similitude to God. So there has to be a unity there, and of course, a beauty. Now, as Etienne Gilson pointed out in his book, The Unity of Philosophical Experience, once the medieval synthesis, realist synthesis, was lost, whether it was Thomistic or Scotistic, or even that of St. Bonaventure, once William of Ockham had dissolved that realism in his own Via Moderna, then trouble started, because you had a long downhill ride towards relativism, idealism, Kant, Hegel, and eventually finishing up in a nihilist perspective. So Father Jaki points out the importance of the first article of the Creed, the belief in God the Father Almighty, maker of heaven and earth, of all things visible and invisible. And Jaki commented that this tenet of the Creed has more interest to it than the fact that it is a tenet which can be known both by reason and by faith. A still unexplored interest of this article lies precisely in the direction of our topic, namely the reality of the universe. The creeds nowhere ask us explicitly to believe in the reality of the universe. Rather, they assume implicitly the universe is real. Before idealism, before the Cartesian methodical doubt came on the scene, there was no need for us to be concerned about affirming the reality of the universe. It was a basic given. But put another way, one can only argue from a real existing universe to a real existing God. So the proofs of the existence of God classically also depend on the reality of the universe, and vice versa. And I don't want to sort of enter into things which are perhaps not my particular area, but I've always been fascinated how in Eastern Christendom they start with belief in God and then pass to the creation, whereas I think in the West they tend start with the creation and move to God. So that there is this complementarity between East and West. And here Jaki argues that the very word Almighty in Greek pantokrator includes topan, which denotes not only a mere sum of aggregates, but the totality, which is the universe, in Greek the cosmos. And cosmos in Greek not only means universe, but it also means order. So that encourages us to take very seriously the notion of the universe and its reality in its parts and in its whole, and it's a reality which we can actually grasp, appreciate, admire, and enter into, because there's this adequatio between the mind and reality, between the reality and the mind. And unfortunately, Immanuel Kant's strategy was very clear. He cast a shadow on the reality of the universe, which is a very long shadow, and it dilutes the very notion of human thought. So Kantian idealist agnosticism called into doubt the very validity of the notion of the universe, and at the same time, the very notion of its creator. Instead, on the other hand, modern cosmology has also provided a powerful demonstration of the contingency of creation. Like any other specific thing, this specific universe has to be the result of a choice on the part of God among many other possibilities. But since the universe is the totality of things, the choice for its specificity can only be looked for outside that totality. As St. John Henry Newman remarked, the idea of the universe is so great that only the idea of its maker is greater. As Jaki notes, most reliable philosophically is, however, the message of modern scientific cosmology that the universe is real and that it is no less specific than any real thing. Both these points were glaring in Einstein's fifth memoir, which contained formulas for the total mass and the radius of the universe. But if the universe is so specifically real, nothing could have been more logical than to ask, why is the universe what it is and not something else? With that question, one would, of course, place oneself within the perspective which shows not a divinized universe, but a personal God free to choose to create one among an enormously large number of possible universes. So realism is the metaphysical bridge linking science with a Christian belief in God the Creator, as can be seen also from the viable, unique medieval birth of science, as demonstrated also by Jaki. In order to actually analyze Jaki's realism more clearly, it should be contrasted with nominalism, positivism, instrumentalism, idealism, and nihilism. And just as for Chesterton there's a Christological basis for realism, so also with Jaki. Regarding the rationality of the cosmos, Jaki again makes clear that its deepest meaning is bolstered up by Christology. He also asserts that it was historically only with faith in the Word that there could come about a categorical assertion about the full rationality of a world imbued by a fully divine logos. The world being created by the supreme logos has a rational structure. We human beings made in the image of God understand natural laws as part of his proclamation left as an imprint on his creation. The distinction between creator and creature and the revelation of Jesus as the only begotten close the doors to any idea of a world regulated by chaotic chance forces. The once for all facts of the history of salvation, stretching from the creation to the redemptive work of the only begotten Son of the Creator and to his second coming in glory to judge the living and the dead, formed for Christians the realist framework of thought, which we've always inherited. Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen. and most grateful. I don't know, sorry to discuss this now, Jose, but since it's getting later here, is it possible for me to take questions at this point at all, or is that not in your program?
We don't have any questions in the chat, but if anyone has any questions they would like to ask Father Hepner, but please, by all means, just feel free to speak up.
To questions, corrections, enlightenment, because you see, I think being here in Rome, it's already coming up to 9 o'clock at night. So the thing is that if you don't know.
So we only have comments in the chat section currently.
I have one, actually.
Okay. Please, Professor Marlowe.
And that is that, interestingly, I do not think that there is anything contradictory in what you are proposing to the idea that instead of a real physical universe, we're looking at a real mathematical model on which the universe depends.
Okay. You'd like me to answer?
You may react if you like.
Well, I mean, thank you for proposing that. It's really interesting. I would say my answer would probably be something along the lines that the mathematical model is a description. To me, it's a description alongside other descriptions. There could be poetic descriptions, literary, but they describe different parts of the reality, even theological. And the mathematical is another description. But in order to make the mathematical description, you need a reality upon which to describe.
There's certainly a quantum physicist, or at least a couple of them, who have proposed that the mathematics is what is there and the reality is only sort of a shadow of it. But
okay. Yeah, no, I would find that difficult to square with day-to-day experience, because to me the quantum is a limiting case of day-to-day. I mean, you can see it the other way around as well. So I would probably feel a bit uneasy with that, because then you'd be faced with a discontinuity with the rest of your experience, possibly. So I would tend to affirm the reality, and that the quantum mechanics is also a part of reality, a description. And reality is probably far richer than we can all probably describe. So I would say probably the universe and different ways of describing it seem to evoke a certain humility, that we, maybe whether we're theologians or philosophers or scientists, we tend always to be trying to deepen our understanding of this cosmos as we go along, so that it's a sort of an adventure, really. And I think that came over in The Man Who Was Thursday by G.K. Chesterton. I think you got that they're chasing each other, and there is a sort of chasing there. They're chasing after a reality as well. There is that quest. It's a quest. So it's not as if we've got, I think it's true in theology, it's true in science, it's true in philosophy. It's not as if we can put it all in a box and then say it's all here, we've got all the answers. I think we're all searching. We're not searching in an agnostic way. We're searching because we've already found something, and that finding is encouraging us to search more.
So we have a question from the audience in the chat that says, what did Father Jaki think of the fudge factors of dark matter, dark energy, and hyperinflation to preserve the Big Bang Theory?
Oh, thank you for that question. I think that's a brilliant question, and I'm really not very sure of the answer to that. I think maybe one of my colleagues would be able to handle that. I mean, quite honestly, I would have to look into what he said very carefully. I know, though, that with the Big Bang Theory, one thing I can say for sure is that it was very clear that there was a relation between the Big Bang Theory, the mathematical apparatus which described it, and the reality of the cosmos. And at the same time, for Father Jaki, clearly, any Big Bang model, and there are various different big models, is not a proof of the beginning of the universe. It's not a proof, either scientifically or philosophically, at the beginning of the universe. For Father Jaki was very, very clear about that. So, so therefore, I think in answer to that question, the matter that was under discussion, dark matter and etc., none of those things would, even for Jaki, Father Jaki, if he was still alive, consist of proof of the existence of an beginning of the cosmos. Of course, Father Jaki said through revelation we know the cosmos has a beginning. But what he talked about, and this is the second part of my answer, is that the rather asymmetrical and unusual specific characteristics of the Big Bang scenario with those sort of dark matter, etc., are indications of the specificity of the cosmos, which means it could be otherwise, which could be an indication, therefore, of its contingency, philosophically speaking. And so the contingency then leads us. So I think my answer would be to the person who put the question, probably contingency is the answer. Contingency. Yeah.
Okay. Thank you, Father Hefner. We are now going to move on to our next panelist.
Do you mind if I? Thank you very much. Thank you, Gloria. Thank you, thank you. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you. So our next panelist is Father Joseph Larrissey, who, as I had mentioned earlier, is the other 2/3 of the Jaki Foundation. He's the treasurer. Father Larrissey received his bachelor's degree in computer engineering and a minor in mathematics from the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign. He then went on to the Massachusetts Institute of Technology to receive a science master's in engineering systems. And he did some really interesting work initially on air transportation systems, fly-by-wire systems, the software, and also hardware applications. He's done a lot of work and continues to do a lot of work with Professor Marlowe of the Department of Mathematics and Computer Science in complex systems and how they work. Father Larrissey then had a calling and went on to the seminary here at Seton Hall University. And then from there, he went on to study at the Pontifical Gregorian University in Rome, where he earned his STB, his STL, and his STD, and his doctorate in particular. He worked with Father Larrissey, and he looked at the different philosophies and theologies that have been developed by Pope Benedict XVI, and as part of that, he will talk about that today. Father Larrissey, further, as I like to kid with him, is in all aspects of our university. He is currently serving as an assistant professor of systematic theology in the Immaculate Conception Seminary School of Theology here at Seton Hall University, but he further has affiliations in the Department of Catholic Studies, the Department of Mathematics and Computer Science, the University Corps, and also the Honors Program. So he's all over the place, and if you walk around campus, you always run into Father Larrissey because he's busy everywhere. Father Larrissey will present today a panel talk entitled "Seer of Science, Benedict XVI." So Father Larrissey, please.
Thank you so much, Dr. Lopez, and thank you, Father Hafner, for your wonderful presentation, and everyone for your participation in this event, honoring Father Jaki's legacy, reflecting on it further, and also the great legacy of G.K. Chesterton. So in his 1986 book, Chesterton, A Seer of Science, Father Jaki explored the contributions of the well-known British author in the philosophy of science. While not trained formally as a scientist, Chesterton's penetrating analysis of the problems associated with modern scientism represent a real contribution to the dialogue of science and theology. Regrettably, the presumed conflict between the principles and methods of the empirical sciences and the doctrines of the Christian faith, the doctrine of creation in particular, remains a persistent problem. Perhaps another seer of science has emerged in the person of our Pope Emeritus, Benedict XVI. The contributions of Joseph Ratzinger, Pope Emeritus Benedict, to the compatibility of the theology of creation and the natural sciences is established upon a very fundamental insight: the primacy of the Logos himself, Jesus, the eternal Son of the Father, who is the source of all rationality, meaning, and purpose in the universe. During his apostolic journey to Germany in 2006, Benedict was invited to address the scientific community of the University of Regensburg in the Great Hall. The Pope's lecture was entitled Faith, Reason, and the University, Memories and Reflections, and further elaborated his thought on the centrality of the Logos. The intelligibility of nature, and indeed of revelation itself, rests on man's ability to share in the Logos in creation. Benedict points out that while the Church has always taught that there is an infinite gap between the eternal wisdom of the Creator Spirit and our created wisdom, there exists a real analogy in which, as the Fourth Lateran Council in 1215 stated, unlikeness remains infinitely greater than likeness, yet not to the point of abolishing analogy and its language. Rejecting a theology of God that he characterizes as sheer impenetrable voluntarism, the Holy Father reminded his audience that the truly divine God is the God who has revealed himself as Logos, and as Logos has acted and continues to act lovingly on our behalf. Openness to the full breadth of Logos provides for the appropriate autonomy and the status of philosophy, theology, history, mathematics, physical science, and biological science. It has always been a hallmark of the Catholic intellectual tradition. Aware of the assaults on the status of some of these sciences, Benedict criticized the approach of those who believe that scientific certainty is the only legitimate form of knowledge, and that it can only be found as the result of analyses based on the interplay of mathematical and empirical elements. After all, the English word science comes from Latin scientiae, that comes from the sciens, the present participle of scio, meaning I know or I understand. When the radius of science and reason is reduced, the question of God and his work in creation becomes by definition unscientific, unknowable, and unreasonable. In this fragmented form of reason, deeply human questions such as the origin and destiny of humanity, and those handled by religion and ethics, have no place within the purview of collective reason as defined by this science, so understood, and must thus be relegated to the realm of the subjective. And this is a devastating shortcoming. Benedict succinctly points out that the subject then decides on the basis of his or her experiences what he or she considers tenable in matters of religion, and subjective conscience becomes the sole arbiter of what is ethical. When theologically and particularly moral questions become completely personal matters, religion and ethics are placed outside of the scope of reason. As the history of the 20th century makes very clear, disturbing pathologies of religion and reason necessarily erupt. Benedict reminds his audience in Regensburg that the modern and postmodern tendencies to attempt to create an ethical system based on the principles of biological evolution, psychology, or sociology are always greatly lacking. One of the causes of the movement to reduce reason comes from the challenge of cultural pluralism. This threat comes both ab extra and ab intra. The influence of Hellenism in Catholic thought has been questioned even by Catholic theologians such as Hans Kuhn. These theologians would try to create some pure version of the New Testament message, not infected by Hellenistic culture, to preach not only in the West, but also in mission territories. Benedict firmly rebukes this reproach, stating, quote, "This thesis is not simply false, but it is coarse and lacking in precision. The New Testament was written in Greek and bears the imprint of the Greek spirit, which has already come to maturity as the Old Testament developed. For this reason, the fundamental decision made by the early Greek-speaking church about the relationship between faith and the use of human reason are part of the faith itself. They are developments consonant with the nature of faith itself," end quote. The rejection of Thomistic metaphysics and the intelligibility that it provides the other sciences did not appear for the first time in the 20th century. The movement of Martin Luther toward a sola scriptura theology was partially rooted in an attempt to remove what he considered to be the alien presence of philosophy and theology. 300 years later, Immanuel Kant suggested that faith needed to be protected from the reason of metaphysics. In other words, the church needed to set thinking aside in order to make room for faith. It becomes obvious when one adopts this mindset that any discussion of a creator and creation is outside the realm of reason and it is understood by faith alone. In his critique of pure reason, Kant introduced the modern self-limitation of reason. Additionally, given the overwhelming success of the empirical method in empirical science, Kant's reduced form of reason was further radicalized, yielding what Benedict calls a synthesis between Platonism and empiricism, a synthesis confirmed by the success of technology. Benedict does not retreat into fundamentalism to respond to the challenges of modernity. Rather, he seeks to identify the positive features and retain them. For example, modernity presupposes the mathematical structure of matter, its intrinsic rationality, which makes it possible to understand how matter works and use it efficiently. This basic premise is the Platonic element in the modern understanding of nature. Furthermore, Benedict emphasizes how modern scientific reason points beyond itself. This approach respects the autonomy and ends of the formal and natural sciences while acknowledging that they do not and cannot exhaustively describe reality. It's a marvelous claim of the Christian religion that the human intellect is capable of knowledge, albeit imperfectly, it's capable of knowing, albeit imperfectly, God, his will, and his work in creation. Furthermore, his invitation to a loving relationship is a distinctive feature of the God of Revelation. At Regensburg, Benedict reflected on the significance of man's relationship with the divine Logos. He said, quote, God does not become more divine when we push him away from us in a sheer impenetrable voluntarism. Rather, the truly divine God is the God who has revealed himself as reason, and as reason has acted and continually acts lovingly on our behalf. Perhaps we could summarize Pope Emeritus' insight here that God is reason and God is love. Deus est ratio et Deus est caritas. Chesterton once remarked, there are arguments for atheism, and they do not depend and never did depend upon science. They are arguable enough as far as they go upon a general survey of life. Only it happens to be a superficial survey of life. End quote. Nonetheless, obstacles remain that hinder people from accepting the compatibility of biblical metaphysical cosmology with contemporary physical cosmology. Often the root of this dismissal comes from a rejection of faith in creation itself. Cardinal Ratzinger identified three forms of concealment of the concept of creation in contemporary thought that contribute to the perceived conflict between science and theology. The first is that nature is understood exclusively in the sense of the object of science. Any other definition of the word is dismissed as meaningless. The second is a reaction and resentment against technology, which is already noticeable in Rousseau and has since become a resentment against humans who are seen as a disease of nature. And the third is that nature is undermined for the sake of grace. It is robbed of its belonging. With regard to the first form of concealment, Ratzinger points out that an inadequate understanding of nature has a detrimental effect on moral life and the ordering of society. For example, theological arguments about the nature of humans or natural rights, resting as they do on a concept of creation, meet a look of blank incomprehension. In fact, they seem nonsensical, the relic of an archaic natural philosophy. In reducing human nature to the mere biochemical structure of man, it is impossible to make ethical statements. All that can be done is state what is feasible, not what is moral. With his well-known wit and humor, Chesterton once remarked, quote, to mix science up with philosophy is only to produce a philosophy that has lost all its ideal value, and a science that has lost all its practical value. It is for my private physician to tell me whether this or that food will kill me. It is for my private philosopher to tell me whether I ought to be killed. Developing the thought of the Swiss biologist and philosopher Adolf Portman, Benedict illuminates the problem of the behavioral sciences adopting the concept of nature for their own ends. The fundamental difficulty is that this kind of naturalness does not exist in man. Portman uses the term natural artificiality to describe the different types of human society and points out how whatever aspect of human social life is considered, for example, language, government, family life, etc., everything is dependent on decision-making. Ratzinger asks, where is decision-making going to find its criteria? Are humans condemned, as Sartre thought, to find themselves in formless freedom? This will indeed be the case if creation is not granted its proper status as the metaphysical middle term between nature and artificiality. In the second form of concealment of the concept of creation, reaction against technology develops into resentment against humans. Mankind is the enemy of nature, disturbing its natural balance and causing it harm. Man uses his mind and freedom to the detriment of nature. For example, the French ethnologist Claude Lévi-Strauss and the American psychologist B.F. Skinner take up the line of thought in which humans must be healed of being human. Skinner would even go so far as to say that free will is an illusion. Ratzinger notes both of these men express a perspective that is becoming more and more widespread and contributing to various forms of nihilism among young men and women. The final form of concealment is profoundly theological and related to the two aforementioned types. Nature is robbed of its belongings by grace. Looking to the New Testament, Benedict draws insight from St. Paul. It is not the spiritual which is first, but the physical, and then the spiritual. When the order is inverted, creation is rejected and grace is divested of its foundation. Far from elevating grace, according to Ratzinger, the undermining of creation can never become a vehicle of grace, but only an hatred of the human race, a Gnostic disenchantment with creation, which ultimately does not desire grace any longer. For Ratzinger, agape, gospel love, is the heart of Christianity and the antithesis of Gnosticism. This distinctly Christian love presupposes faith in the Creator, self-acceptance as his creature, and concern for one's neighbor. While the natural sciences are an essential discipline for understanding aspects of reality, reality itself transcends the natural sciences. According to Ratzinger, moral, religious reasoning, in contrast to physical, natural scientific reasoning, is not a mere expression of superstition and subjective preferences. It is, in fact, the more fundamental of the two reasons, and it alone can preserve the human dimensions of both the natural sciences and technology, and also prevent them from destroying mankind. Many people today seem very willing to make a natural act of faith in favor of UFOs, or not too long ago, remember the so-called Mayan doomsday of 12/12/2012. I believe that with the help of divine grace, an effective articulation of the Christian theology of creation can help these same people to see in the design of the universe a manifestation of the love of the Creator and have faith in the divine revelation of the Logos. For this reason, the Church hopes that men and women come to know the Lord, who out of the abundance of his love speaks to men and women as friends and lives among them so that he may invite and take them into fellowship with himself. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Father Larrissey. I don't know if there are any, there's one question that just came up. If in religion we live by faith, hope, how does science understand hope and see the mystery of God?
Very good question. Often in the Catholic intellectual tradition, when we're talking about hope, we're fundamentally talking about hope in the Lord, hope in his fidelity to his promises, particularly the promise of eternal life, the gift of salvation that begins in the sacrament of baptism. And that's really the basis for Christian living, for trusting in God's goodness, no matter what terrible things might come upon us. And all of us are suffering in so many ways as a result of this pandemic. So it's a good time to turn again to what is the source of our hope? Where do we find salvation? What is our ultimate end? And as people of faith, we believe it doesn't end with death, but in fact, God offers us eternal life. That infinite desire is satisfied in God alone, and God in heaven.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay. So we'll take many questions at the end of the panel discussion. So let's thank Father Larrissey for his wonderful presentation. Our next panelist is Dr. Dermot Quinn. Dr. Quinn was educated at Trinity College in Dublin, Ireland. He then went on to the New College at the University of Oxford, which is, I always found ironically called New College, but it was founded 600 years ago, but Oxford was founded 1,000 years ago, so I guess it is new. It's a relative term there. But Dr. Quinn went on to get his doctorate degree there. He then went on to Seton Hall University to become a professor of history here at the university. He is also a member of the Board of Advisors for the G.K. Chesterton Institute for Faith and Culture here at the university. And he is also an editor and member of the editorial board of the Chesterton Review that is published here at the university. Dr. Quinn is also an expert historian on the local Irish community here in New Jersey. He's written a book on that. He's also very knowledgeable about the local archdiocese and various churches here, the history of them. And he is also the official Seton Hall University historian. And he's promised me over many years that he will publish that book about the history of Seton Hall University, which I've been waiting on for a good part of a decade now. So hopefully he'll publish it at one point. His presentation today is entitled Chesterton, Jaki, and the Challenge of Science. Dr. Quinn?
Well, thank you very much, Dr. Lopez, and thanks to everybody for coming along this beautiful afternoon. As I listened to Father Hafner's wonderful presentation and Father Larrissey's wonderful presentation, I get an increasing sense of inadequacy and a lack of qualification to speak on the matters that we are speaking of this afternoon. But I will certainly do my best. Well, it is a pleasure to be with you this afternoon to pay my own tribute to the life and work of Father Stanley Jaki. And anyone who ever met him will testify that as a scientist, a philosopher, a theologian, a historian of ideas, and author, he knew his mind, and in every sense gave us the full benefit of it. Today's conference is an opportunity to explore the richness of that mind and once more to pay a debt or to repay a debt to it. It's also an opportunity, I think, to enjoy that mind in conversation with other minds. When Father Jaki discovered Chesterton, he realized that here was an intellect as penetrating and versatile as his own, a philosopher of tremendous incisiveness, as he said, who had prophetic things to say about science, scientism, evolution, and cosmology. And part of Chesterton's appeal for Jaki had to do, I think, with their shared love of limits. Chesterton believed in the boundaries and rules without which creative freedom is impossible. Art is limitation, he said. The essence of every picture is the frame. If you want to draw a giraffe, you must draw him with a long neck. If you want to write a sonnet, it must have 14 lines. You cannot play chess using your own private rules. And Jaki also believed in boundaries, particularly those boundaries that delimit one intellectual activity from another. He wanted physicists to do physics, not metaphysics. He wanted geneticists to deal with genetics, not the book of Genesis. And by the same token, he warned of the dangers of misusing science for non-scientific purposes. Jaki could spot a category mistake at 50 feet and pounce like a cat, mauling it to death. And I think likewise Chesterton. Science cannot forbid man to believe in something which science does not profess to investigate, Chesterton wrote. The visible order of nature follows a certain course if there is nothing behind it to stop it. But that fact throws no sort of light on whether there is anything behind it to stop it. That is a question of philosophy or metaphysics and not of material science. End quote. Well, this insistence that philosophy should be left to philosophers does not mean, of course, that any philosopher will do. Philosophers are as capable of bad thinking as anyone else, as susceptible to bias, prejudice, and subjectivity, as prone to those lazy intellectual habits that Francis Bacon called the idols of the den. To examine, prove, disprove, or reconcile the philosophies of Europe would be the task for a philosopher, Chesterton said, but not for a philosopher like Bertrand Russell. Indeed, scientism is a good example of that Baconian error of thinking that one's own way of looking at the world is the only way of looking at it. When Galileo claimed that the book of nature is written in mathematical symbols, what he meant was not that he had discovered one possible way of reading it, but the correct way of reading it, to which other ways of reading must give way. And from that piece of intellectual impudence, much grief has followed. Where then to begin? Well, for Jaki, a good place to start is the Ethics of Elfland chapter of Chesterton's 1908 book, Orthodoxy. It is a chapter as curious and brilliant as its title, for in defending Christian orthodoxy, the philosopher Chesterton most resembles, at least to begin with, is the Scottish atheist David Hume. Here, for example, is Hume on the nature of knowledge. All the objects of human reason or inquiry may naturally be divided into two kinds, to wit, relations of ideas and matters of fact. Of the first kind are the sciences of geometry, algebra, and arithmetic, and in short, every affirmation which is either intuitively or demonstratively certain. That the square of the hypotenuse is equal to the square of the two sides is a proposition which expresses a relation between these figures. That 3 times 5 is equal to half of 30 expresses a relation between these numbers. Propositions of this kind are discoverable by the mere operation of thought. Though there never was a circle, though there never were a circle or triangle in nature, the truths demonstrated by Euclid would forever retain their certainty and evidence. That's Hume. And he continues, matters of fact, which are the second objects of human reason, are not ascertained in the same manner, nor is our evidence of their truth, however great, of a like nature with the foregoing. The contrary of every matter of fact is still possible, because it can never imply a contradiction. That the sun will not rise tomorrow is no less intelligible a proposition, and implies no more contradiction than the affirmation that it will rise. So that was Hume. And here is Chesterton. There are certain sequences or developments, cases of one thing following another, which are in the true sense of the word reasonable. They are, in the true sense of the word, necessary. Such are mathematical and merely logical sequences. If the ugly sisters are older than Cinderella, it is, in an iron and awful sense, necessary that Cinderella is younger than the ugly sisters. But as I began to take notice of the natural world, I observed an extraordinary thing. I observed that learned men in spectacles, talked as if the trees bear fruit, as if trees bear fruit were just as necessary as the fact that 2 and 1 trees make 3. But it is not. All the terms used in the science books, law, necessity, order, tendency, are really unintellectual because they assume an inner synthesis which we do not possess. Well, Hume could not have put it better. Factual claims have a different logical status from analytic claims. The latter known to be true or false simply by thinking about them. The former by the test of experience. We know that the swan is white or black by looking at it. We cannot know it in any other way. But here, I think the similarity ends. Hume's project in the inquiry concerning human understanding was to destroy metaphysics. Cast it into the flames, he said, because it contains nothing but sophistry and illusion. The greatest illusion, of course, being the religious beliefs that it makes possible. But his primary purpose was to dethrone metaphysics. His secondary effect was also to dethrone the natural sciences. After all, he had shown, as Brian McGee has written, that we cannot demonstrate the existence of a world external to ourselves, that we cannot validate the existence of causal connection in any realm, that there is no such thing as inductive logic, that strict proof simply plays no part in human life outside mathematics, that our thoughts are connected for the most part not by logic but by association of ideas, and that our behavior is guided not by genuine understanding of reality, but by habitual expectation and custom. Well, few philosophers have wielded a wrecking ball as formidably as Hume, but many of his admirers seem not to recognize precisely what he has ruined. Those who celebrate his destruction of metaphysics and turn instead to positivist and scientific accounts of the world often fail to notice that he has destroyed those as well. Even his own atheism withers in the face of a skepticism that denies that any general view of the ultimate nature of things is capable of rational demonstration. Hume was not interested in final causes because he thought we could not speak intelligibly about them. In fact, he said, most of us are incapable of speaking intelligibly even about simple causes, mistaking the fact that B always follows A as entailing that A causes B. Nothing could be further from the truth. Causation implies a claim of necessity, which is not available to us in the world of factual contingencies. The sun is under no obligation to rise in the morning, although, of course, it would be very inconvenient for us if it did not do so. Well, Chesterton understood this argument intuitively. In the science of mental relations, he said, there really are laws. In the realm of physical facts, there are no laws, but only weird repetitions. But here the two men part company. Hume said that the world does not explain itself. Chesterton replied that that is precisely the point. Facts are arbitrary and mysterious. The weird repetitions become no less weird for being repeated. The startling strangeness of the world is an invitation to wonder and to gratitude. A tree grows fruit, he said, because it is a magic tree. Hume was interested in the weird repetitions only to the extent that we mistakenly believe them to be necessary. Chesterton was interested in them because we know that they are not necessary, and yet they recur day after day to our obvious benefit. Humean skepticism seemed a very paltry response to them. Existence itself was so very eccentric a legacy that I could not complain of not understanding the limitations of the vision when I did not understand the vision they limited. You should not, he said, look a gift universe in the mouth. Hume had nothing to say about this gift except to deny that it was a gift. To deny, in other words, the existence of a giver. But Chesterton had a great deal to say about it. So much, in fact, that every word he wrote seems to be a kind of vote of thanks for it. To help him offer that vote, he turned to St. Thomas Aquinas, that huge, heavy bull of a man, as he described him, fat and slow and quiet and abstracted. A man rather like himself, in other words. Father Jaki is not alone in considering Chesterton's book on Aquinas as among the deepest of all his writings. Etienne Gisson famously hailed it as, without possible comparison, the best book ever written on St. Thomas. Nothing short of genius can account for such an achievement. If it is a work of genius, that is not so much because Chesterton understood St. Thomas, as because he understood what Thomas understood. That, quote, the primary and fundamental part of the Catholic philosophy is entirely the praise of life, the praise of being, the praise of God as the creator of the world. Everything else, Chesterton said, follows a long way after that. For Hume, the central questions of philosophy are epistemological. For Aquinas and Chesterton, they are ontological. Hume wants to know about knowledge. Aquinas and Chesterton want to know about being and its connection to knowing. When a child looks out of the nursery window, Chesterton writes, and sees anything, say the green lawn of the garden, what does he actually know? Or does he know anything? There are all sorts of nursery games of negative philosophy played around this question. A brilliant Victorian scientist delighted in declaring that the child does not see any grass at all, but only a sort of green mist reflected in the tiny mirror of the human eye. This piece of rationalism has always struck me as almost insanely irrational. If he's not sure of the existence of the grass, which he sees through the glass of a window, how on earth can he be sure of the existence of the retina, which he sees through the glass of a microscope? If sight deceives, why can it not go on deceiving? Men of another school, this is still Chesterton, men of another school answer that grass is a mere green impression on the mind, and that he can be sure of nothing except the mind. They declare that he can only be conscious of his own consciousness, which happens to be the one thing that a child is not conscious of at all. In that sense, it would be far truer to say that there is grass and no child than to say that there's a conscious child but no grass. St. Thomas Aquinas, suddenly intervening in this nursery quarrel, says emphatically that the child is aware of ends. Long before he knows that the grass is grass or self is self, he knows that something is something. Perhaps it would be best to say very emphatically, with a blow on the table, there is an is. Well, Chesterton develops this idea, I think, with uncommon brilliance. The child, having grasped that something is something, instantly grasps that it cannot be something else. Whatever you call what he is supposed to be doing, seeing or dreaming or being conscious of an impression, he knows that if he is doing it, it is a lie to say that he is not doing it. The law of contradiction is intuitively certain. But what is equally certain is that the facts themselves even as we grasp their reality, also have a disturbing mutability. They are always in the process of becoming something else. They seem to allow the skeptic, whether Hume or Heraclitus, to claim that there is nothing except change or comparison or flux, that there is in effect nothing at all. But Aquinas insists that the initial certainty remains reliable. This is Chesterton again on Aquinas. There is no doubt about the being of being, even if it does sometimes look like becoming. That is because what we see is not the fullness of being. We never see being as much as it can be. Ice is melted into cold water, and cold water is heated into hot water. It cannot be all three at once. But this does not make water unreal or even relative. It only means that its being is limited to being one thing at a time. St. Thomas maintains that the ordinary thing at any moment is something, but it is not everything that it could be. Thus, while most sages come at last to nothing but naked change, he, Thomas, comes to the ultimate thing that is unchangeable, because it is all the other things at once. While they describe a change which is really a change in nothing, he describes a changelessness which includes the changes of everything. Things change because they are not complete, but their reality can only be explained as part of something that is complete. It is God. And this God is a creator God. Aquinas was quite certain that even if the world were entirely without end or beginning, which he denies, it still has logical need of a creator. And it is the creativeness of things, their contingency, that allows us to glimpse the uncreated God who has given them to us as pure gift. Well, it is easy to see how Jaki, as priest and scientist, was so taken by Chesterton. In summarizing the Summa, Chesterton offered in popular form a statement of Jaki's own core convictions, which Jaki himself summarized in 1978. These were, quote, the existence of mind as distinct from matter, the fundamental importance for scientific method of an epistemology embodied in the classical proofs of the existence of God, the limited validity or relevance of exact science or physics, the crucial importance of Christian belief in creation for the unique rise of science. Well, such ideas were not uniquely the property of Aquinas and Chesterton, of course, but Aquinas and Chesterton were powerful exponents of them. And the last of these core convictions, the crucial importance of belief in creation for the unique rise of science, is Jaki's most important purely historical argument. He makes it by way of contrast, saying of the ancient Mesopotamians, for example, that the promising creativity of Hammurabi's age was not followed up in later times, either in literature or the arts or in legislation, let alone in matters of scientific thinking. The basic reason for this failure is neither geophysical nor socioeconomic. They remained trapped in the disabling sterility of a worldview in which not reason ruled, but hostile willfulness. Believing as they did that they were part of a huge, animistic, cosmic struggle between chaos and order made it impossible for them to realize that to influence or control nature one had to be able to predict accurately its future course. As a result, the mastery of science could not become a proud feature of a land on which ziggurats cast their somber omen. And here's Father Jaki speaking of the ancient Egyptians. Much of their intellectual history has been a long stagnation in the morasses of an animistic and cyclical worldview, which in turn rested upon their conception of the watery abyss as the ultimate entity, one from which there could not emerge an unambiguous and effective pointer suggesting the presence of clear, rational laws in the universe. The idea that the ancients failed to progress because they lacked science gets it exactly the wrong way round. They lacked an idea of progress because because of this, they failed to develop science. Capricious gods, gods who, in Einstein's phrase, play dice with the universe, were not for Jaki. To see clear, rational laws in the universe was not, as Hume claimed, a logically impermissible illusion, but, as Aquinas insisted, a participation in the divine intelligence itself. The metaphysics comes first, then the physics. It was the metaphysics that encouraged experiment, exploration, creative engagement with the world. The essence of Thomist common sense, Chesterton says, is that two agencies are at work, reality and the recognition of reality. And their meeting is a sort of marriage. Well, science is the child of that marriage. To be sure, Jaki's advocacy of these positions has generated criticism as well as praise. He had sharp elbows, was not averse to polemics, and could be strikingly dismissive of critics. A standard complaint is that he was guilty of the same categorical confusions he condemned in others. That, in other words, his scientific claims are really a disguised form of theology. Well, as an objection, this is unfair, not least because Jaki himself never disguised the theological implications of his or anyone else's scientific work. Some of the criticism is ad hominem, the fact that Jaki was a priest, and as such, not to be taken too seriously. On the other hand, Jaki himself taught us that ad hominem arguments should be taken seriously. He taught us that the human element in science is vital, that confirmation bias is real, that our preference for some explanatory models over others is often subjective and sociologically driven, that the Baconian idols remain obstacles to good science and clear thinking. That he was not immune to such dangers himself is unsurprising. Some of his work does have a certain Procrustean quality, everything squeezed into his four-pronged schema, leaving little room for anything else. There is the Milky Way and the Jaki way, and sometimes you think the second is as important as the first. But these are minor objections to an undoubtedly major achievement. And even the major objections do not seem insuperable. As a liberal Protestant theologian, writes Kenneth Coffin, I'm not as convinced as he assumedly is of a perennial philosophy and a development of scientific theory. Philosophy and theology are historically and culturally relative and subject to development. Any proposed correlation or synthesis of science, philosophy, and theology must be frankly recognized as tentative and incomplete. Well, I think this self-refuting relativism may say more about liberal Protestant theologians than it does about Jaki. We should not return to traditional dogma or to biblical metaphysics and cosmology, writes Kevin Sharp. but should ground each in, quote, modern scientifically informed cosmology. We should return, in other words, to Galileo. Perhaps we should return instead to Jaki. He was a force of nature, but also, to his credit, an admirer of Chesterton. Chesterton, he said, was an implacable antagonist of those who, in the name of science, be it anthropology, sociology, or psychology, applied their dissecting scalpel to the wholeness of man, and above all, to the wholeness of man's mind. He fought them because he had grippingly vivid insights to tell about the mind's unique powers. He fought them because he had hope. In so describing Chesterton, Jaki seems to have described himself. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Quinn, for your presentation. In lieu of the time, any questions people have, we will go at the end after our next panelist. So our next panelist is Dr. Stacy Trasankos. Dr. Trasankos received her Bachelor's of Arts in Biology from East Texas State University. She went on to receive her Master's in Dogmatic Theology from the Holy Apostles College and Seminary in Cromwell, Connecticut, and then went on to receive her PhD in chemistry from Penn State, Pennsylvania State University. She then went on to work at DuPont as a senior research chemist. From there, she went on to leave that career and raise her family. And then from there, she's continued now as a scholar in many areas of science, of the intersection between theology and science. She is now recognized as a nationally recognized author, speaker, and an educator. She is the executive director of the St. Philip Institute for Catechesis and Evangelization that was founded by Bishop Joseph Strickland in the Diocese of Taylor, Texas. She is also a teaching fellow at the Bishop Robert Barron's Word on Fire Institute. And Dr. Trasankos is an author of 3 books on the topics of faith and science, and has written numerous articles for Catholic journals and magazines, and has appeared she has appeared on various radio and television shows discussing these matters. Dr. Trasankos, please.
Hello, thank you. And thank you all for being here this afternoon to consider these 2 very great men in the Catholic intellectual tradition. We were all telling a bit of personal stories with Father Jaki. I never met him. I'm a convert, and learned of him in my very first theology class, which I took after I was a chemist and after I'd left to stay home with my kids, left DuPont. I read his book, The Savior of Science, holding my youngest child, a newborn, and reading this book. And it really moved me how Jaki compared the stillbirths of science in all the other ancient religions, giving them their due for their scientific accomplishments, but also saying that science never became a viable, self-sustaining discipline. It was never born in the other cultures the way it was in Christianity, which led to modern science. And I thought it was beautiful how he talked in such life-giving language about Catholic dogma. And that led me to think very hard about what his message is and how best to share it, because I don't know how Father Jaki had time to write all the things he did in his lifetime. I don't think I have time to read it in mine. So he left us a great treasure, and I'm very interested in how to pass on the basics of his teaching to the next generations so that they can continue and we can continue to build on his ideas. In that spirit, I also want to talk about Chesterton. And I titled this talk, The Thrilling Romance of Orthodoxy and Modern Science. And I got this from a long quote from Chesterton in his book, Orthodoxy, the end of chapter 7. And I would like to read this with you because I could not possibly paraphrase it better. As you all know, Chesterton was very gifted with his poetry and language, something as a chemist I lack. But Chesterton put it this way, talking about orthodoxy, about what God revealed to us, the traditions of the Catholic Church, the truth cannot contradict truth. He says, "This is the thrilling romance of orthodoxy. People have fallen into a foolish habit of speaking of orthodoxy as something heavy, humdrum, and safe. There was never anything so perilous or so exciting as orthodoxy. It was sanity, and to be sane is more dramatic than to be mad. It was the equilibrium of a man behind madly rushing horses, seeming to stoop this way and sway that, yet in every attitude having the grace of statuary and the accuracy of arithmetic. The church in its early days went fierce and fast with any war horse. Yet it is utterly unhistoric to say that she merely went mad along one idea, like a vulgar fanaticism. She swerved to the left and right so exactly as to avoid enormous obstacles. She left on one hand the huge bulk of Arianism, buttressed by all the worldly powers to make Christianity too worldly. The next instant, she was swerving to avoid an Orientalism, which would have made it too unworldly. The Orthodox Church never took the tame course or accepted the conventions. The Orthodox Church was never respectable. It would have been easier to have accepted the earthly power of the Arians. It would have been easy in the Calvinistic 17th century to fall into the bottomless pit of predestination. It is easy to be a madman. It is easy to be a heretic. It is always easy to let the age have its head. The difficult thing is to keep one's own. It is always easy to be a modernist, as it is easy to be a snob. To have fallen into any of those open traps of error and exaggeration, which fashion after fashion and sect after sect set along the historic path of Christendom, that would indeed have been simple. It is always simple to fall. There are an infinity of angles at which one falls, only one at which one stands. To have fallen into any one of the fads from Gnosticism to Christian Science would indeed have been obvious and tame. But to have avoided them all has been one whirling adventure. And in my vision, the heavenly chariot flies thundering through the ages, the dull heresy sprawling and prostrate, the wild truth reeling but erect. And that's how he ends chapter 7. I want to take that thrilling ride of orthodoxy, that threading of a needle, that standing erect with the precision, mathematical precision, in the way that the church has guarded the truths of faith, and the church has preserved divine revelation, not because it's a set of rules that she wants to lay down heavy on us and make us mind her ways. The church has guarded the truth because it tells us who we are and what we're doing in this universe. It tells us what the universe is. It helps us to look out at the universe and see what's there, as Frank Sheed once put it. And Father Jaki utterly preached this adherence to orthodoxy. But he understood what was meant by that word. And I think that's one reason he had such a great respect for G.K. Chesterton. This is a picture, by the way, it's one of my favorites as well, that Antonio Colombo shared with me. After I told him I never got to meet Father Jaki, but I was very excited by his work, where he's here looking out at this water. It's a nice picture. So The other presenters have covered this, especially Dr. Quinn in his talk, talking about what it is about the Christian view of the world that is so different from the other ancient religions who had the stillbirths of science. It's a chasing after reality, to echo what Father Hafner said in his talk. Science is a chasing after reality. The development of doctrine, understanding how the revealed truths that God gave us apply to our times, like we're trying to do with the vaccines, it is a chasing after reality. We're seeking the truth. And Father Jaki pointed out that when we say that science was born of Christianity, he's talking about the worldview that always was in Christianity, from the Jewish people, the idea that in the beginning God created the universe. It's literally codified in the very beginning of the Bible. And it was something that God revealed to us. St. Thomas Aquinas takes this up as well. And it was something that I found, when I first heard it, I thought, that's not something you think about every day, but it's so deeply true. It's something I think we take for granted. And I think a lot of people in our world today take this for granted, including atheists or secularists who don't understand that the way they view the world is actually in many ways Christian, that the world had a beginning in time. This is not something that can be proven by science. It's not something that can be demonstrated. It's something that we know only because God revealed it. The other cultures thought the universe, they looked at the cycles in nature, the cycles in life, the cycles in the cosmos, and they assumed in various ways a pantheistic view of the world, that it is eternally cycling, that there is no absolute beginning. There might be a beginning of a new cycle, but there's no absolute beginning. And this led to different views of God as the universe emanating from God, or the universe being God. And you see varieties of this. And Father Jaki goes exhaustively through those ideas in one of his larger works, Science and Creation, which there's no way to get into in a 20-minute talk. But it was this absolute adherence to a beginning in time and creation, both things, a beginning in time and a creation out of nothing. That there was an absolute beginning, a point in which things external to God began to exist. There was nothing, and then there was that primary act of creation. And that heaven and earth, when we pray the creed, in the beginning God created the invisible and the visible and the invisible. And Genesis says he created heaven and earth. That is the whole universe. A universe. Father Jaki wrote extensively about that idea. And down through time, in various ways, from the church fathers through the Middle Ages, and even into modern times, refuting this heresy of modernism and materialism, that of the pagan philosophers and that of the modern materialism, they all, like I said, different ways, assumed the eternity of the world. And that was always rejected by the church. The world began to exist. It has not always been cycling, that because none of that would jive with what we know of the incarnation. There couldn't have been an infinite number of Christ who became incarnate. It happened one time. So it all fits together in this way. And I want to go through dogma. I want to go through just to highlight the significance of what Father Jaki says in his books about this subject. If you go, for example, into Ludwig Ott's Fundamentals of Catholic Dogma, even there, talking about de fide dogma, the most certainty, the highest degree of certainty that pertains to immediately revealed truths from God, there's some very fundamental things that actually set our worldview for the ability to do modern science, keeping in mind what Chesterton said, that quote that I read. That all that exists outside God was in its whole substance produced out of nothing by God. I'm reading from Ott's book. The Vatican Council declared against the ancient pagan and Gnostic Venetian dualism, as well as against modern monism, that is like materialism or pantheism. Those were heresies that were rejected. The Venetian dualism refers to the separation of spirit from the body or from the physical world, a separation, whereas in Catholicism, we teach the unification of the body and the soul. And materialism being that there is nothing spiritual that exists. There is only the material world. Those were rejected time after time after time down through history. In philosophical, theological parlance, by creation, what we mean is the production of a thing out of nothing. Before the act of creation, neither the thing as such nor any material substratum from which it was produced existed. So I think that is profound, and maybe creation out of nothing is sometimes hard to think about because we don't really know how to think about nothing. But this is such a simple point. Even my youngest, that newborn I said I was holding, when he got old enough to learn his CCD classes, I was reading the Baltimore Catechism with him. Chapter 1, the very first thing it said was, God made everything. And he understood that, but he also knows his mother, me, is a chemist, and he hears me talk about atoms a lot. But it was really beautiful how simple this was, something I never would have thought to teach my child without the truths of faith. The Baltimore Catechism says God made everything, and you're supposed to ask the kids the questions, and it says, who made you? God made me, he said. And then it said, God made me out of, and I waited to see, God made you out of, and I was expecting him to say nothing, but he said atoms, because he hears me talk about how everything's made of atoms. And I thought that was so simple, but it was such a great opportunity with this little boy who was 4, that we sat there and talked about the difference in creation out of nothing and secondary creation, how God made everything out of nothing, literally out of nothing. Like, try as hard as you can to think about that. God made everything out of nothing. And then from that matter that evolved over time, God spun out everything that exists today, including atoms and including the laws of nature that atoms follow to make something like a 4-year-old boy's body, which blew his mind. But it was beautiful. It was such an appreciation for the handiwork of God. And just moving through in the dogma here, the creation out of the world out of nothing, according to general Jewish and Christian conviction, is directly expressed in Genesis 1:1. In the beginning, God created heaven and earth. In this basic text, no substratum of creation is named. In the beginning literally absolutely meant an absolute beginning, a point in time before which there was nothing side by side with God, and in which the things external to God began to exist. So that is something that we've always taught, and it is something that's important to science. There have been times, of course, in the history of science when there was also assumed an ever expand, an eternal, I don't know if they didn't really call it eternal, but a universe without a beginning. And it was only with someone asked the question that the Big Bang came about, that we started to think about there being a beginning. But Father Jaki would say to that, do not use science to prove what we ought to hold in faith. So the Big Bang assumes a beginning, but it doesn't, again, actually prove a beginning, but it does fit together with what we understand about creation. There's also the work of the world is the work of divine wisdom, that there is reason and order and logic in creation. That is why we can do something called science. That's why we can apply mathematical equations, quantification to objects in motion. Without that worldview where you expected things to be so ordered, you might not think to start applying equations, but since that, because of that worldview, look what we can do now. We can take 70 6 of the 92 naturally occurring elements on the periodic table and make smartphones that allow us to communicate digitally. So it's amazing what we have been able to do because we expected there to be order in the universe. The world is the work of divine wisdom. The way I like to say it to people is in one sentence, to sort of blow away the cobwebs of that tired old conflict myth between science and faith, is that science is the study of the handiwork of God. And, you know, I got that from studying what Father Jaki had to say. Science is the study of the handiwork of God. We look out at the universe and we say thank you to God for creation. And then when we do science, physics, chemistry, biology, and all their branches, we are probing into the mystery of creation and trying to understand just a little bit more. If you are a scientist, if you're a student and you aspire to be a working scientist, or if you're pursuing a PhD in science, that's the really cool thing about it, is that you're learning about the mind of God. You're learning about how God made creation. You're learning about how things work in creation. You're studying the handiwork of God. And if you do pursue a PhD in a scientific field, you have to discover something new. It can be very, very, very small, but you have to push back that veil a little bit and understand something new. You have to contribute new knowledge to your field. And if you're looking at the world this way through your lens of faith, that's pretty exciting. That's a really exciting thing to do, to think that you understood something about creation for the first time, that you can share in this march towards progress that we're all taking as we live out our lives as humans. Another dogmatic truth: God was moved by his goodness to create the world. So the world is created good. There have been variations in ancient religions where the world wasn't seen as good, where if you're trying to separate the spirit from the body, it's because those religions saw it as rejecting worldly things, physical things, and trying to unite your own soul with the soul of the universe. And there's some truth in that, but it's not the fullness of the truth. God created the world good. And so we see that the church fathers testify that God did not create the world because he needed to, but in order to pour out his benefits. And that comes from Irenaeus. Origen teaches in the beginning, when God created what he wanted to create, rational creatures, meaning us, he had no other cause for it but himself, his goodness. So he created us in goodness as well. Augustine says, we are because he is good. We are because he is good. So the world was created for the glorification of God, we can say. The last 2 points I want to make very quickly about dogma in modern science is that the Trinity in creation, the Trinity, it's one principle, one God, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, that there is this working together. There's not just God the Father created the universe or God the Son. It is working all together. And St. Augustine said the general teaching of the theologians is that creatures unendowed with reason are a trace of the Trinity. Those gifted with reason are an image of the Trinity, and those endowed with a saving grace are a likeness or a similitude of the Trinity. So here, thinking about what that means to modern science, or why science was born, why we have the sciences today, the physical sciences and biological sciences, that's as self-sustaining disciplines. God created all the things with reason. There's order in the universe. There's order, and that's why we have a periodic table, because atoms follow such order that we could put them in a chart and study their quantum numbers, come up with quantum numbers to define what we see that atoms are able to do and how they're able to react, so we can manipulate what they do and make things. But the world is ordered. But then we, being rational creatures, being made in the likeness, image and likeness of God, we are able to want to study that order. We are able to actually study that order and to understand something about it. That's why I say kind of jokingly, you don't see any scientific journals produced by monkeys or any other creature, but humans. Humans have scientific journals because humans do science. We yearn to know the truth. We yearn to know more about our home, creation, our planet, our universe, our galaxy, and we seek to understand these things. And if you don't grant intellectual assent to the truths of faith, you still have that yearning to understand the world and understand yourself. You just don't really have any kind of language or way of making sense out of it. But with what God revealed to us, we can make sense out of it. We're studying God's handiwork. The last thing, just still going in through Lott's book, the world had a beginning in time. To return to that idea, Father Jaki goes through, I said before, he goes through the ancient religions and to demonstrate, to give facts about their view of the universe. But he also then goes through the Hebrew cultures. He goes through the writings from early Christianity, the church fathers, all the way through time, constantly showing this world view and how it led scholars to start to ask questions about quantifying motion in the universe, which is what led to modern science. And it was significant that we had this worldview. The eternity of the world, like I said, I'm reading from Ott's book, cannot be proved by philosophical arguments. As the existence of the world is due to a free act of God's will, God does not necessarily will that it should always exist. And that comes from the Summa, from Aquinas. The discoveries of modern atomic physics afford the possibility that in virtue of the disintegration process of the radioactive elements, to echo back to Father Jaki's work, the age of the earth and thereby its temporal beginning may positively be proved. And that is quoting from a speech of Pius XII in his Fiat Lux, when he said the proof of God's existence, he saw, this was when the Big Bang was becoming articulated. He saw that natural modern science was proving God's existence. And I just want to end with dogma here, saying that, and this was in response to a question as well, Jaki would not have agreed that the Big Bang or any other scientific theory absolutely proves God's existence in a deductive kind of way. You can say in an inductive kind of way that it points to the bigger conclusion that God exists. You can say that what we learn in science points to God in the way that you would look at the periodic table or chemical equations or quantum mechanics and say there's so much order in the world, there's so much symmetry and beauty. This is not the mind of a human. This is the mind of God, the one and only God. And so inductively speaking, you could say that of the Big Bang, but you could also say that about anything in creation, whether it's a rainbow, flowers, clouds, anything that you express awe and wonder. And I really think then, to get to the last points, this is a book. So I wrote this book for myself, really. I wrote this book so I could get my head around what Father Jaki meant by that, because I found myself trying to talk about it. And it was hard for me to say what he meant by saying science was born of Christianity, but it's fundamentally what I just explained. I have a foreword written by Father Hafner, but it comes from mostly these two books that Father Jaki wrote. If you would like to read more about him, this is The Savior of Science. This is Science and Creation, which is an earlier book. And I also find it very useful to read his intellectual autobiography, A Mind's Matter. And I have this picture here of my book because I don't actually have a copy of it. So I'm just showing you a picture of it. But what do I think about this? So I think if you put the two together, Chesterton and Jaki, and if I understand Father Jaki correctly, and if he were here, he would tell me if I don't. But what do we make of orthodoxy and modern science? Again, I think you can distill it down to one simple line here, not to oversimplify, but enough to explain it to people, to get them interested in what Father Jaki wrote. Science is the study of the handiwork of God. But I think if we move forward with what he's saying, there's also an evangelization opportunity through science. And that's not something you hear people in the culture of the conflict myth talk about, but I do think there is an opportunity to evangelize. And I mean by that, there's nothing more powerful. You know, if we can look at the universe and reason that God exists, there's nothing more powerful to add to what we can just see with our eyes in nature than what we know with modern science today. If the Maccabean mother could look out at the universe and have faith in the faithfulness of God to restore the breath and life to her sons that were martyred, if she can just look at the universe and see that, how much more could we today look at what modern science has discovered down at unimaginably small levels? I mean, we base our time on the cesium-133 atom, who's in the ground state of that atom, it's hyperfine splitting, its little electrons jiggle 9,192,631,770 times per second. Okay, it's so precise that we can mark our seconds by it. The time it took me to say that, multiples of 9 billion jiggles occurred. So, I mean, it's mind-blowing, but there is a real joy and awe and wonder to be found in modern science. And I think you'd have to be pretty intellectually dishonest, insane maybe, to not think about what we know in modern science today and not ask the next big why. Why does all of this exist? And of course, science can't tell you that. You got to move on to philosophy and theology. So I think there's a powerful opportunity in modern science to lead people to Christ. And I also think Father Jaki might, if he were still alive today, and if we could build on his work, I think we could say the scientific revolution, or at least a theory I work with, or a hypothesis I have, I don't think we could say the scientific revolution is complete. If the scientific revolution, and some scholars argue it didn't really happen, and so it's just a matter of opinion. But if there was this scientific revolution where there was an explosion of our understanding, our knowledge of how the physical world works, if modern science arose and that was the scientific revolution, and if what accompanied it was this separation of science from philosophy and theology, because that knowledge came to be seen as old and not discovering new things, whereas smartphones, modern science came to be seen as exploding and finding cures and ways to make our lives better and cure us from diseases. If there was a separation, I think it's our work moving forward based on Father Jaki's teaching to keep going. I know this is not a new concept for Catholics, but to keep going to reunite them. So if there was this separation in a revolution, if you think of a revolution as a full circle and not just half a circle, in physics we do, right? So if you think of it as completing the circle, I think what we need to push for in the coming decades is a reunification of modern science with philosophy and theology, not to put it back to the way, not to go backwards to the Middle Ages and that understanding, but to move forward in a more mature. And I had the thought after getting my head around Father Jaki's work, that if science was born of Christianity in the beginning of the scientific revolution, then modern science maybe is kind of like the prodigal son who's wandered away from the Holy Mother Church, wandered away from its mother. And I'm working on since we call the Holy Mother Church a mother, modern science needs to come back to God. And I don't think that's something that, I think that's something that takes a lot of explanation. But if we really want to understand the handiwork of God, we have to, in a more mature way, reunite modern science with philosophy and theology from whence it was born. And I think that's a very exciting prospect for young people who want to become scientists. I think it's absolutely the reason why scientists never need to check their faith at the door, because faith should be guiding what we do. Faith and virtue, hope, faith and love, and practicing virtue and making good decisions. And that's all stuff you find in Catholic teaching. So I will conclude there so we can move on to the questions.
Okay. Okay, thank you, Dr. Trasankos, for your presentation. We're a little over the hour. We were expecting to finish before 4 o'clock. So we just have a little bit of time if everyone is okay to ask a few questions. I've been monitoring the chat, and there's been more discussion, very interesting discussions going on there, more so than questions. But does anyone in the audience, we'll open it to the floor. Does anyone have a specific question they would like to ask? You can turn your microphone on if you'd like.
Yes, hello?
Yes, go ahead, Mark.
Yeah, I'm in my car, so no video. What I wanted to say is a beautiful presentation, but now we're talking about God and science. Now, in the book, Dr. Zhivago, Boris Pasternak, there's the beginning chapter, which isn't covered fully in the movie. The uncle who is a fallen, he left the seminary, he was thrown out of the seminary, and he's talking to young Yuri Zhivago about Christology and history. And what he infers is that eventually, as the end times come, science, philosophy, and faith will come together, and Christology will all come together again. You know, that out of paradise, we fell out. In paradise, we were all united. And is this what you think Jaki and these other great thinkers were going at? Any of the panelists or the last madame who talked? Yes, hello?
So it's open to the panel if anyone would like to.
Yes.
Put
Is
some.
that the way we're moving? Would they agree with that based on their looking at Chesterton and Jaki? I had read Pasternak's work many times, and I find it very interesting, that first chapter in Dr. Zhivago, where he talks about that to young Yuri.
I haven't read, I'm not familiar with that work.
Well, that's why I explained. What happened is he's a former Orthodox seminarian, and he's saying that we're, you know, to young Zhivago, that all of these things are going to, Christology, science, and philosophy are all going to come together at the end of time when Christ comes back. The same day they were in paradise from the beginning.
I think it definitely could happen. It makes me think of that quote in, what's the quote? I have the book on my shelf. Where the scientists climb the mountain and they find the theologian sitting there waiting for them. What is that book? I forget. Yeah, no, I think you're right.
Okay, thank you. I just wanted to know what these other thinkers were aiming at, like Chesterton and Jaki especially.
Well, we're all moving towards a great completeness in God. As we enter in our mutability, the immutable. And I think that Pasternak is expressing that in a beautifully poetic way. So I think you're right.
Okay.
Yeah, that's what I got out of it.
So yes. One of the things maybe that Dermot, being the Chesterton expert, when I think of Chesterton, I think of, you know, fictional writing. And I think of, you know, the Father Brown mysteries and such. But when I also think of him, I think of his contemporaries. I think in particular of H.G. Wells, the great science fiction writer, Jules Verne, I guess, who was a little bit older than Wells and Chesterton. But in particular, when you talk about Jules Verne and H.G. Wells, you talk about basically, I guess in the case of H.G. Wells, an agnostic, or I would say an atheist, who did not believe that Jesus was was the Son of God and did not believe in God in general. When you talk about Jules Verne's and his writings, his fictional writings, and of course I'll also mention they did a lot of other writing that was nonfiction and influential on the thought of the time. and Chesterton seemed to be, talking in many cases against them. When you talk about Jules Verne's, he was more of a, I guess, a deist philosopher in a sense, that where he believed in a God, but not necessarily in the Jesus myth, as he, I guess he would call it. And it seems to me a lot the great, as Dermot mentioned, and in your presentation, and as others mentioned too, that Father Jaki was such a fan of Chesterton because he seemed to fight that thought that Jesus was not, that was an influential character, an influential influence on how society developed and how science developed. What I'm just asking is have we gone beyond that stage in a sense where the progressiveness of man, or the significance of what man, and when I mean man, I mean humanity, I mean men and women, have achieved scientifically, technologically, which is what the age in which the Jules Verne's and Chestertons and Wells were living was advancing so significantly that you could almost say this work, this society, this world that is building up around me is due to the genius of man versus the influence of God. Do you think that is maybe what's caused the current de-emphasis of Christianity in Western culture, and in a sense also brought to a pedestal the significance of science? It's a very loaded series of thoughts there.
It certainly is, Jose. There's a lot in what you say. I mean, a couple of thoughts. First of all, Chesterton and H.G. Wells were kind of great intellectual sparring partners. Chesterton had enormous respect for Wells, and Wells had enormous respect for Chesterton. They respected each other's intellect, but their worldviews were completely different. And Wells's outline of history is just a kind of classic text, almost, of a sort of progressivist, you might say, Whiggish view of history as the unfolding of a kind of inevitable progress. And Chesterton's book, The Everlasting Man, can be seen as a sort of response to that. And Chesterton's fundamental view is that progress or progressivism is a kind of an empty term. I mean, it's simply a direction which is sort of agnostic as to the point of direction, that what does this actually mean when we get down to the nitty-gritty? And the answer is not a great deal. I come back to, and I kind of repeat what Father Larrissey said and what Stacy said, that these are not questions which go away. That these are the fundamental questions of humanity, answered with a kind of a brilliant succinctness in the Catechism, but capable of wonderful amplification in Scripture and in the tradition of the Church, and of course in the writings of Chesterton and similar wise people. So I don't think that I would be all that comfortable, Jose, with this notion that we are, so to speak, beyond the primitive myths of 2,000 or 4,000 years ago. We're certainly not. As Stacy points out, all of the extraordinary achievements of science are essentially invitations to a deeper sense of wonder about our participation in the mind of God. I have yet to hear a scientist who has constructed a convincing philosophical response to that. So much, and this comes back in a way to what Dr. Marlowe said at the beginning of, the first question that I asked of Father Hafner, the notion that the mathematical model is the basis on which reality rests. Well, I think the answer to that is that reality is the that the mathematical model is a description and not an explanation of a reality whose mystery we can glimpse but not fully understand. So I'll kind of leave maybe Father Joe and Stacy to make a response to you as well.
I think you handled that very well, Dermot. Dr. Lopez's question was an excellent one, but a challenging one. And I think you answered it well.
Well, I mean, with that sense of creation of a reality, that if you refer to a Burns or a Wells from 100 years ago at this point, they would say that the progression that was going on was due to the genius of man, not necessarily influenced by a god. While Chesterton argued the counter opposite, right? That it was because of the influence of God that man was able to achieve what we've achieved. So would you say in the year 2021 that has that battle been won? Are we still waging that battle? The sheer prominence of where we are now versus 100 years ago is pretty clear. I mean, even though they were imagining flying in planes and going to the moon and submarines and stuff, that really hasn't happened till relatively recently.
Yes, we've done wonderful things, Jose, like giving ourselves the capacity to blow ourselves to smithereens. I mean, I'm not entirely sure that this is a morally neutral progress.
Yeah, but I mean, it's possible to go into a laboratory and do really good science without having a bit of faith. I mean, I did it. I don't know how good the science was, but I did work as a scientist, and you don't have to think beyond your science. It's just, it becomes a problem, and I think that's the problem. I think that is the case today, and the problem today is that I hate to be cliche, but there's not a lot of critical thinking. There's not a lot of pushing the big questions, and it's possible to live your life. It's possible to worry about the stock market and what you're going to buy at Walmart and what school you're going to send your kids to and what kind of car you're going to buy next. And you can operate that way, and you can operate that way as a scientist and solve problems in front of you. It's just that if you want to step outside of that, if you really thirst for a fuller truth and you want to understand why you do that, why do we have Walmarts? Why do we have communities? Why do we have laws? Why do we care about what happens to each other? If you want to understand what drives you to care about science and drives you to do good things with it, and then guides you in what those good things actually are, then you have to look beyond that, just that problem that's right in front of you. And I think a lot of people don't really realize that what they're seeking is God. They're looking for answers, and of course we say we have the fullness of the truth, and the church guards those answers. But I think there's a lot of ways in which we teach the faith today, whether it's theology or whether it's even catechesis for young children, that don't really instill in them the idea that the truths of faith help us to lead our lives. It's not just something we memorize and then something we go to school and do science. It all fits together.
Good point. I mean, we know in the medieval universities, when the concept of the university came up, that mostly it was to educate men of faith at the time, priests, and sciences were taught to them directly. And now in a modern university in the 21st century, I know from our campus School of Theology, there are no science classes that are taught to our seminarians directly. There's questions there. Has science split to such a point where it's not able to Jaki would argue that the point of science and that science derived from Christianity and theology and religion in general, because it was to understand the mind of God in a sense, not exactly, but along those lines. Most people now would argue that the point of science is to live a more comfortable life and allow us to have Zoom workshops and conferences like this. So I think it's a very pending meeting there. So I'd like to thank all the panelists for their wonderful, wonderful presentations. And I'd like to bring us back to our host and Master of Ceremonies, Dr. Inez Muzaku, for the final word. Thank you.
Thank you, Jose.
Inez, could I get in just one quick remark and one question? One remark, Stacy, and that this is a very nice complement to some of the things you were talking about, is that in the early years of Islam, not the first couple of centuries, but from about the 9th, 8th to the 13th or so, there was enormous scientific progress. In fact, we keep finding more and more scientific progress. And it influenced the scholastics and Aquinas and later philosophers. But then, to use your analogy, or Chesterton's analogy, its chariot went off the rails. It was beginning with the same assumptions. It was making enormous progress. There's a huge, we keep discovering, and Father Larrissey and I have found this in teaching our core 3 course, that we keep discovering new things that they did that parallel Copernicus and other later scientists, but they went off the rails. So that was the observation. A tricky question, which I asked in the chat, is that Hume and Chesterton, and for all I know Aquinas, if you look carefully, acknowledge the absolute validity of relative truths. Do those rely on creation?
The absolute validity of relative truths. By that you mean relations of ideas?
Relations, mathematics, logic, theoretical computer science, if you will, things along that line.
Mm-hmm.
Are those dependent on creation, or are they, as Hume says, you didn't have to have a circle or a triangle exist in order for those statements to be true and demonstrably true?
Well, then we return to the question. Well, it comes back, I think, to a point that Father Larrissey was making when he was quoting Benedict XVI, and Benedict's wonderful phrase about impenetrable, sheer impenetrable voluntarism. By which I understand him to mean a kind of willfulness which would have God play dice with the universe. I mean, I don't want to put words into either Benedict's mouth or Father Larrissey's mouth, but that's essentially a kind of shorthand way of talking about sheer impenetrable voluntarism. And the answer to that is our participation in the divine intellect. So to answer your question, Tom, it seems to me that what we have are necessary truths, which are as true for God as they are for us. And that seems to me ultimately to be the response to the separate question of creation. Those are two kind of fairly distinct questions. But to answer the first question, our apprehension of the necessary truths of relations of ideas, that apprehension is a participation in the divine intellect, which is as distinct from, as Father Larrissey says, and as Benedict says, as distinct from the sheer impenetrability of the divine will, or of nominalism. Joe, would that be a response that you would make to Tom?
Yeah, that's an excellent response. I concur with everything you said, and I feel like the issues that Tom raised are a good springboard for a second conference to keep the discussion going.
It is tricky because the question of necessary truths and our participation in necessary truths are not the same question.
Yes.
No.
And I will agree on the latter without necessarily always conceding the former. And it's a very tricky issue.
Yeah, I agree with Father Larrissey. It's a hard one, Tom, because if you look at Christian thought, Aquinas, which I agree probably had many thoughts about this, but I'm not a Thomist, having read everything. But I mean, Christianity believes in sort of truth, reason, logos, as Father Larrissey was talking a lot about, and reasoning the truth through logos, and which is what modern science professes and talks all about. But then it also believes in revelation. And that God reveals him or her, whatever. God reveals things. And if you talk to sort of any modern scientist or engineer or anything for that matter, if I said, the reason my my aircraft is flying is because God revealed to me, how to do it, how to engineer that. I mean, you're going to be in a loony bin pretty soon. So I think that's kind of what seems to have been lost in what Jaki argued was the split that was happening that had to, and what Stacy was also, I think, to an extent arguing also, needs to be brought back to revelation and the reasoning to get to the truth, or as you're saying.
Well, yeah, that's right, Jose. But these were positions established by Aristotle, distinguishing between final causes and efficient causes. So we have wisdom to learn from Aristotle. Those categories remain absolutely the categories that we should be using when we begin to talk about what it is that science claims to tell us. If it claims to tell us what it cannot tell us, then we have to call it out. We have to call it out.
Yep. So without, this is a wonderful discussion, and I agree with Father Larrissey. We should organize another workshop to discuss many of these things and think further about them, and develop scholarship on them. So without further ado, I'd like to bring back to our Master of Ceremonies, Dr. Inez Murzako, for the final word.
Yeah, thank you very much, friends, for this wonderful workshop and all the, wonderful questions and discussions that we had. And I just want to let people know that this revelation, reason and revelation, this is also the main point actually of, we proposed a new minor in faith and science. So that is what we are going to focus, as a university. And I kind of slightly disagree with you, Jose, because of course, through Catholic studies, we are introducing all these courses, in science. We have a number of courses actually to make up a minor for this combination, of faith and science, right? So I'm very hopeful that that minor in faith and science will be approved. With that in mind, actually, I want to thank everybody again, and I received a very nice message, actually, even from our provost, Dr. Passerini, who was very interested, actually, in this kind of discussion, interdisciplinary discussion. And but due to timing, it was 2 p.m. when we started. She couldn't make it, but she sends her. And with that in mind, we have to prepare for next year's Father Jaki's distinguished lecture and also the panel. Okay, so thank you very much, everybody. We can continue this via email. Everybody here among the panelists is in fact a Seton Hall faculty. So
Thank
okay.
you, Inez.
Thank you, Inez.
Thank you.